The name of the workshop is Developing a Bioenergy Business Case. And I would like to introduce you to Blair Hogan, who will be our speaker. So welcome, Blair.
Hi, thank you so much for having me here. Blair Hogan, Gunta, Huat Dusa, Ishkatania Khat, Shadahani Naklaha, Shudusach. I'm from Teslin, Yukon. We're in right above BC and beside NWT and Alaska. And if you're aware of our region, we are full of woods. We have a lot of forestry resource in our region. So with the Teslin Biomass project, if you're tuning in today, we're going to be talking about the Teslin Biomass project, which is a small case study, biomass case study in my community, and I can talk about my experience with that and that project, and just some of those project milestones that I think fairly commonly all projects need to achieve, and then we're going to be more specifically focusing on the business case of biomass. So for those who don't know me, and I don't see any names that I do know yet, just a few joining us so far. But my name is Blair Hogan. I am a business consultant. So I was trained in UNBC, Bachelor of Commerce, where exposed me to kind of this economy that is not talked about in the business school, right? Community economic development is really kind of glossed over. Not-for-profits and cooperatives and the power of the collective entity, that's really glossed over. It seems like the business school is very focused in training accountants and people in finance and some sales, HR. They're very focused on the cores, but it's about kind of what I did with that education. So in my community, Teslin, Yukon, what I noticed is that my community was very planning oriented. And I think I might just fire up the PowerPoint at this point. And just to let you know, too, Svetlana is going to be collecting questions. We have a very small group. I think we're going to be pretty informal here, guys. So feel free to interrupt me and ask questions. I want this to be as useful as possible. And there's a lot to go through in a little time. So I do want to be focused on what you're most interested in. So with that, I will just start taking us through the slideshow. Hopefully you're able to see the slideshow as I'm seeing it. Let me know if you're not. So as I said, Gunta Business, we've been based in Whitehorse, Yukon. I'm originally from Teslin. That's my First Nation, Teslin Tlingit First Nation, Teslin Tlingit Council in Southern Yukon. So Gunta Business, the business that I'm part of, is 100% Indigenous owned and operated since 2012. We're basically an integrated consulting service, more specifically on business plans and engagement. Just as kind of a bit of a shout out, we have launched a virtual event service. We're giving huge kudos to this virtual platform and this virtual event. But we've been focused more on the community hybrid virtual events to assist Indigenous decision makers, most specifically virtual general assemblies. And we've been working with almost every Yukon First Nation in that regard. We were honored with Top Indigenous Business of the Year, as recognized by all the Arctic Chambers of Commerce for year 2020 for our positioning in the global pandemic, as well as we just were awarded yesterday the Yukon Innovation Prize, first place, for our virtual event services. But back to the bioenergy business case. So the Teslin Biomass project. There's a lot of resources out there. I encourage you to check out. We have a lot of YouTube videos, Google Teslin Biomass Project. APTN did a video on Power to the People, episode 9 of their first season, where they came and actually did a really beautiful profile of the Teslin Biomass Project. But for today, it's a 1.3 megawatt thermal community-wide district heating system. And so this was focused on the school, the big heat user in the community. And the Yukon government decided we're going to take biomass on. We need key community and private partners. So we opted to take that challenge on, but we expanded that project to make the economics work when you're incorporating a full supply chain, which we'll deal with in this workshop. The fuel source for this district heating system is waste wood, and it's processed into wood chips. So there's a few different types of biomass projects out there. There's cordwood biomass projects, there's wood chip biomass projects, there's pellet projects out there. And this one very specifically is wood chip, and we will talk about why. This was, and maybe just kind of a future kind of perspective, that there's an expansion, there's lots of expansion opportunities. There's an inclusion of a sawmill now and all the residuals that you would generate from a sawmill. And it's just added value for that added scale up. But let's just talk about kind of what got Teslin there, and maybe a little bit of background on Teslin. So the Teslin Yukon, Teslin Tlingit Council First Nation, it's one of the 26 modern day First Nation treaties in Canada. So there's 11 of the 14 First Nations in the Yukon have final agreements and self-governing agreements, which just means that there was a real strong collective effort back in the 60s and 70s to really organize, generate kind of comprehensive agreements that became the framework for all the other agreements that occurred in the Yukon. It's a bit of a social experiment in governance, localized governance, and self-determination. So my First Nation specifically was one of the early implementers of the final agreement in 1993. And this has generated all kinds of stuff. So right in the 90s, as you can see, there was money attached to this deal. If you think about land claims, it's basically like real estate plus. It's like it's a real estate sale with more value, that you still get to maintain governance, you still get to regulate wildlife and resource extraction and development and planning. You always got a seat at the table. But effectively, you give up a lot of your traditional territory to the Crown, and you maintain selected parcels for exclusive use. So that's a real high level nutshell of what the final agreements were. There's so much more to that, not giving it justice, obviously. But part of that, there was a financial compensation. And that compensation got a lot of First Nations in the Yukon into forestry. So Teslin, Haines Junction, Watson Lake, there was a number of Yukon First Nations that spent big money to get into forestry in the 90s. It was a golden era. There was community economic development. Everybody's working with their hands. They're using skills that bring them into the forest, to get them out on the land. It was so highly aligned, golden era. The problem was all the eggs were in that basket. It was highly a community employment program. You know, if you're in the world of economic development, that makes a lot of social and community sense. It doesn't make a lot of wealth sense or dollars. So in this case, and in many cases, and softwood timber crises that unfolded, and the age of protectionism of the United States, these things became unviable. And in our case, in our community, it was so politically interesting that there was uneconomic decisions to keep going, even though break-evens weren't being met and profitability wasn't being achieved. So that collapsed in. There was a lot of planning that kicked off. So forest management planning and zoning and community economic development planning, and bringing us to 2016, where there was actual negotiations and plans to implement biomass heat for the school. And as I was mentioning in my intro, that expanded into the First Nations assets, the big buildings, and third-party heat agreements for those that aren't owned. And we'll talk about ownership models and those types of arrangements that are needed for scale when we're talking about creating business cases. So why is business planning important? And as you can tell, I hint at things as they're coming up. Research is your best friend. And, you know, I've met countless interested champions, renewable energy champions, or economic development champions from their communities. And they hear about biomass and they really want to get involved. Or, you know, they're interested in this opportunity. And there's always so many options to consider. And there's, when we're talking about biomass, we're talking about technology, so many technologies to consider. And just because something works in one context doesn't mean it's going to work exactly in yours. So there's so many things to consider. When you start diving into it, so there's challenge. You need business planning to challenge your thinking to the entire project life cycle. Is there a question? I'm hearing some feedback. If not, maybe just mute your microphone. But weigh in, please, at any time. Cost weighed versus attainable value. So, when you're thinking about these beautiful projects, and just like when you're buying a vehicle, there's so many options, you start getting a little bit option crazed and you want everything. Well, certain things have certain value and certain things have less value. And it's about kind of weighing that attainable value with the cost. And, that's really kind of business planning thinking. And the final piece, which is something that gets me really excited about community economic development, is recognizing and planning for all the opportunities all throughout the value chain. And what I mean by that is when you're building a biomass renewable energy heating system, there's not just the labor and the construction and then the supply and then the expertise and the consultation and the design, but then there's the supply of wood fiber and the processing and then the forestry, and then there's heat sales. You start really widening that value scope and the full value chain, and you see all of these things that as a community you can start either moving entities towards or moving people and businesses towards that start occupying that value chain locally. So there's so much to talk about, and it's easy to get segued into anything. But I do want to focus on the heart of this presentation, which is talking about district heating systems. So all district heating systems have basically a heating loop. And many times this heating loop is an underground line. You can get away with a heat plant right in a big building, like an airport or even a school perhaps, and you can get away with having that type of heat plant being sourced, wood fuel sourced. But that's not what this presentation about today is about. I think what we're really excited about at Gunta Business is community problems, and communities are always dealing with scale. There's usually not one building that would justify a full biomass solution, that you start to need to patch together 4 or 5. And then when you do that, you create some beautiful economies of scale and synchronicity and a lot of streamlining. For instance, if you put together 7 buildings and you start understanding what their heat utility requirement is, you could build something perfectly scaled for all of these buildings that has redundancy, that's scalable, that's sophisticated, and that's better than you could have provided any one building in particular. So you create robust solutions for your entire community's heating needs when you start collectivizing these types of infrastructures needs together. And district heating is one of those perfect examples of that. So the heating loop, so when you create a district heating plant and it's burning wood chips, and that burning of the wood chips, it's at a high efficiency, it's not giving off a lot of particular, there's no smoke to be noticed, it's a little bit of moisture coming out the tops because these things are ultra efficient. And then that heat is passed on to water. That water in the biomass plant it's got a non-freezing agent in the water, a glycol, and it's sent to the buildings that it's heating. In this case, it's a bunch of houses, or it could be institutional buildings, including residential buildings. And that hot water is circulated through a bunch of heat exchangers in those buildings. Those buildings are brought up to temperature. They stop circulating heat or requesting the heat from the biomass plant, and the pumps turn off in the biomass plant. But how we typically design these things is that we have a number of heating units all working together efficiently, heating a water tank. And then it's ultra efficient for just water pumps and thermostats in homes calling for the heat, and it's just water pumps discharging or kind of circulating the water pumped or the water tank's reservoir of hot water. So that's kind of the overview. The heating loop is a huge cost, obviously, because you need to dig, you need infrastructure to dig. The equipment is, the pipes are quite insulated, and you need a return and a flow through line as all in one. So that's all buried. You have your fuel storage and handling system. So as part of a biomass heating plant, there will be like a receiving bay for wood fuel. And so that wood chips are delivered to that biomass plant in the wood fuel and handling system. And so that takes it into what we call a day bin. That day bin has some corkscrew lines that pull wood chips through from the day bin into the biomass burner, and then it's consumed in the biomass burner and turned into heat and so forth. And then finally, it's the heat plant itself. That's the heart of the district heating system. So this is the biomass unit. We're seeing all kinds of technology across Canada, across the world. The Nordic countries and European countries have really been the leaders of these types of infrastructures, these types of technologies. And we're seeing a lot of great examples of European technology in communities in Canada. So why do people even do biomass? Like, what's the point? So these numbers are more of these are more of a northern community. I think it would be kind of across Canada that you do see, at the pump, heating oil, $1.40 per liter. Propane is always, a little bit less, $1.10 per liter right now in our area. Right now, electricity is 18 cents per kilowatt hour. We're getting metric ton wood pellet deliveries for $300. We're able to order $200 or $190 per bone dry ton of wood chips locally, and you can get a $250 cord of firewood. But what does that all mean? And those numbers don't exactly tell you intuitively what's the best deal. And so you have to go through this process of kind of moving through the conversion factor. Well, how much energy is actually in propane versus heating oil versus electricity? And then how do we actually create an apples to apples comparison so that everything is under the same comparable? And so that's this conversion to price per kilowatt hour. And then we convert that to price per gigajoule, just because kilowatt hour is a kind of an electricity friendly variable, and gigajoule is as well, but seems to be favored in biomass. So as you can see here in Teslin and many communities that we work with, this is the variable difference. This is $43.40 per gigajoule of heating oil versus $11.88 per wood chips dry. And when you look at firewood, even though firewood is in the same realm, wood pellets is kind of right in that same ballpark. And then you really do see electricity and propane not being that much better alternatives other than heating oil. There are marginal differences, and it's hugely sensitive to what the price is, the market prices at the day. And when we do business planning, we do all kinds of sensitivity analysis to show what does a $10 change in a $10 per ton or a 10 cent per liter change, how does that affect the bottom line? So that's the obvious revenue, is straight up what's the cost of fuel versus fuel. And just going back for a second, you see there's a huge variance there that allows for some significant business planning value, but there's less obvious revenue potential. So as business planning for our district heating systems, you got to look at the maintenance savings and the avoided replacement. These are new systems and largely funded. And so it's sometimes difficult because whenever you're going into these infrastructures that you're replacing this heating system with, sometimes there's some really good infrastructure still in place. And fortunately, you don't need to remove it. You can maintain it, and it could always be a backup. So that's something to understand. And I think the final thing here is that just think about your savings and maintenance costs, that your older infrastructure is not being used to the same degree as it was, and your newer infrastructure, which is high technology, really robust, is a lot less maintenance required. And that's been our experience in Teslin and the many projects that I've talked with outside of combined heat power. I'm not talking about combined heat power today. Carbon tax savings, carbon credits. This is kind of a new thing, where there's carbon credits coming onto the market. If you have a renewable energy project, there is an opportunity to get kind of carbon credits so that people can basically lend you money on the green feeling that they're putting money into a bond that's being utilized for renewable energy projects, and then they have that ability to kind of offset on their usage. So that's a huge kind of this green economy that's seen elsewhere, that we see that's kind of really coming into place in Canada. And then just the carbon tax savings at the just not buying heating fuel, and the carbon tax that's associated with each unit of purchase you're saving by using a fuel source that has no carbon tax on it. The other less obvious revenue potential is third-party heating agreements. So this is where a project becomes a little bit more complicated. You start adding other jurisdictions, other decision makers, other personalities, other political agendas. Things start to become more difficult. But in a small community, it's a necessary burden, because we're sometimes dealing with too few infrastructure, or not enough of a concentration. A heat map, if you will, is what some of the consultants produce when they come into community. They generate these heat maps of your heat loads, and then the biggest heat bubble is really good opportunity to focus these district heating systems, because there's enough nearby heat load to justify the cost. So that's what third-party heat agreements come in, is that it's sometimes crazy when you go into a community and a First Nation gets funding and builds out a heating system for these 3 buildings and ignores the giant building right beside it because it was too complicated, third-party heat agreements, yada, yada. But what I'm trying to encourage is that there's enough success out there in New Brunswick, in PEI, in NWT, throughout BC. Ontario now is getting a lot of success with these types of agreements, Alaska, and now in the Yukon, where these third-party heat agreements, there's templates out there, there's success, which breeds confidence. And it's always the bureaucrats that you need to bring along with you when it comes to these types of third-party heat agreements, especially when they're government, and it's usually government. What this does is it allows for you to expand the footprint of the project, sharing the cost as well as the risk, and it established long-term commitment. So for instance, in my community's case, or in your community's case, you have a big school, you negotiate a heat agreement right on the onset, they agree to a 20-year heat agreement, they're going to pick up their portion of the costs, they're going to pay a monthly fee and a per kilowatt energy fee based off of their use, which is heat metered. And there you go. You have an agreement that the banks will recognize as a long-term financial commitment, and it just increases your business case. And I've already kind of mentioned it, the green financing. The green financing is kind of this growing thing. We are being approached because we work with a lot of communities that are working on biomass. What is the best community, or the most progressive community, or the nearest to shovel ready that we can finance or be part of the financial solution to that project, because they have a stable full of investors who are really eager to get the green splashed onto their portfolio. So, and please interrupt me now if you want to. This is kind of a natural break. We're moving into projected costs.
We actually do have a question from one of the participants. So Alvin is asking, is there an ongoing maintenance cost for the wood-generated systems? Is there creosote buildup that needs to be cleared periodically? That cost, what are the impacts on annual operations?
Yeah, it's a great question. It seems like a question that was born out of some of the older or late model biomass projects that I will say I've toured a lot of the 90s into the 2000s and even the early 2000s. There was a lot of misplaced focus that in the Yukon, and I'll talk about the Yukon more openly, really set biomass back. And in a lot of these cases, they were oversized systems, singular burners that need to be at a certain output to become even efficient. And often, when these engineers come into these buildings and they have a heating system in place, that if anybody who's an engineer who has to cost these types of systems out or does energy auditing of buildings will already know that most heating systems in place are 2 to 3 times bigger than they need to be. And there's a lot of reasons why. These systems too are able to scale their load effectively. In biomass, it's a bit different. So what I've seen in a lot of these old systems is that they have, let's say that anticipated district heating peak consumption is 200 kilowatt hours or 200 kilowatt. And then they'll build a 400 kilowatt system. And then you're recognizing, or let's just say they build that 200 kilowatt system. They build it for peak. We don't ever recommend to build for your peak. We say build for a little bit below your peak. And then what you find is that where you're generally operating in that 60%, 50%, 40% of your highest ever peak of the year, that's where your operating zone is generally 80, 90% of the time. And then when you start looking at, well, you already got a redundant heat load built in. We don't need to build for the peak. We could just run the fuel heating system 10% of the time. So when we design projects, and I'm in the business planning stages, we always look at the current intact heating system, and we always anticipate using it to a very small level to just manage the heat, the peak loads. So in effect, newer systems, they're not getting creosote buildup. In many cases, we're not ever recommending a single biomass boiler for a district heating load. We're recommending an array. So you can have 2, 4, 6 in an array. These will, let's say you have a 400 kilowatt peak, or let's say you have a general 400 kilowatt operating requirement. You could have that in 4 or 6 units, all at 100 kilowatts each. And they will basically computerized scale in and scale out, always each unit operating at near optimal efficiency. And so we're not getting the creosote buildup because we're not having to go to those extreme high heats. It's always optimized specific to that unit. It's very computerized and automated. So we're not seeing that. What we are seeing is ash, and that's always there because we're dealing with wood waste. You can control your ash depending on your feedstock input, but we really encourage waste wood. We want it all. We want to get rid of the stuff that it costs money to get rid of. That just further adds the value to the community and the business case that we're operating in. And in those cases, we get a little bit more ash, but the ash is marginal. We're still talking about a cup about this after about a week of use. So there's not the questions that were asked specifically. I feel strongly that is kind of more representative of systems past and some of the past thinking of how to appropriately scale and design these systems for community utilization. Hopefully I answered that question.
Yes, perfect. Alvin said excellent response. Thank you. And we have another quick question here from Adam. With the new federal greenhouse gas offset system, how do you see the new carbon credit system impact bottom lines? If one is producing carbon credits through an activity, would it be a significant revenue stream?
Thank you for such a great question. I can't answer specifics to that. I need to learn more about this program. I do know that it's always been, and so we're talking about specifically a biomass thermal. I know it's been a little bit confusing for us on the thermal renewable energy front, that we're not part of the electricity regime, and that it's not really well understood how green credits and that applies to us. I think they're starting to broaden their definitions of green energy, and that's what we've done in the Yukon. Is we've really worked locally. There's some orders in council that really focus certain entities and funds at renewable energy, and it was very explicit on electricity. And I'm just not 100% sure how widely that's interpreted at this point. So biomass thermal right now is the direct benefit is that you're not paying the tax, the carbon tax when you're buying your fuel. That's the direct benefit. And then green financing factors in. And then I do know that there is a lot of work being done on like trying to offset the amount of heating fuel and transportation fuel that's consumed in Canada. And it really does make sense to start widening that scope. So apologies that I can't answer that more specifically, but it is a great opportunity, I think, to further the business case of these already very tight business case projects. Okay, so I'll please interrupt me again. I'll just continue. So when we're talking about projected costs, so as a business planning consultant, we always have to look at these significant cost categories when it comes to projecting the cost. So first of all, there's pre-construction costs. These are the costs associated with getting the job site up in order, to doing any of the kind of pre-foundational work. Then there's the construction and development costs. And then there's the operational costs. So these are the three kind of major phases of any biomass district heating system. And we'll look at these in detail. So that's just the overview, and let's jump into it. So preliminary construction budget. Here's kind of what we use when we're assessing a potential biomass project. So as I mentioned, the pre-development costs, and we'll jump into an example here in a second, but I just want to run over the main components. So we got the pre-development costs, site development costs, the biomass boiler system, the fuel storage and intake system, which is it's kind of a separate kind of building or intake storage and building. District heat piping network, I mentioned that's the buried network connecting your buildings. Then the actual energy transfer units, meters, installation. So think about that, all the infrastructure that's in each building and home, that it now is able to take that heat and disperse it throughout its unit. There's miscellaneous owner costs, and then you start getting into those unallocated cost contingencies that always need to be budgeted for. And then we start getting into wood chip storage building with concrete pad, the equipment, and some of those value adds like sawmill and greenhouse. So very specifically, I just want to run through. This is I had permission to share this. This was an actual project. It was a biomass project in Canada that required some bids. It required what's called a request for qualifications, or request for qualifications. But we very specifically asked the technology suppliers to bid very specifically. And so what I'm going to show you today is when they don't bid very specifically, and I'll tell you, they never do. It's like comparing an apple to an orange, to a grapefruit, to a watch. It's really hard to create like an actual value to value comparison. So this tool that I'm giving you will help with that. So we break it out into these major cost categories. We ask the suppliers to cost, but they're very proprietary around their costing. So a lot of them group stuff up. A lot of them exclude things completely. Some of them include things that you never asked for. So we go through this. And as you could see in this RFQ comparison of proposals, we chart out those who did put their number. And then and then some points we show that it's actually included elsewhere, or it's not included at all. And so we go through this process of determining those who added additional items that were out of scope, we need to identify the value of that and then remove it from the bid comparison. The next thing that we need to do is we need to estimate the exclusions. When you put it into a chart like this, you can start to see the exclusions. Well, bid number 1 didn't actually give us any value for number 2, and neither did 3 or 4, but thankfully bid 2 did. So the nice thing is when you group these bids together, you can start creating at least some value categories, and you can start creating at least an assumption list. And then you are at least able to start costing what the exclusions were. And then you're able to kind of move those costs back into the bid so that you have a total bid plus exclusions for comparability minus the out of scope. So that's the formula, is the bid plus exclusions minus out of scope. And then when you do that, then you get an actual comparable. And then you're able to make a value-based award. Of course, there's other metrics for success. This is purely price and completion of bid, which is important. So what the suppliers don't see is these additional costs, 7, 8, 9, 10. So as an owner, and if you're representing the owner or the owner yourself, you have the construction and project management that you need to secure and represent you. There's a construction phase inspection, testing, construction phase insurance, permits, fees. There's unallocated costs because there's always costs that are unforeseen. And then, if that wasn't enough to break your business case, or for you to recognize how you really need to expand the scope to make a valuable business case, how are you going to supply it? Are you just going to supply it with pellets imported from another region? You're probably going to get a lot of the same business case benefits that I've outlined, except you're not going to receive any of the local economic impacts. You're not going to receive a lot of the forestry and local economy building aspects that these projects are fruit and parcel with. You're not going to see a lot of the supply chain value added items that could be added later, like sawmill inclusion and so forth. So that's a big decision, but it's so important, and it drastically affects how your project is perceived in the community, the more value added you create for the local economy. In this case, in Teslin, we took that burden on. We recognize it's not only important to create the heating system, but we need to build out the supply chain and develop that local economy around it so everything's working. And so that's why 9 and 10 on this cost pre-development budget is important. It's important to build your wood chip storage building with the concrete pad for quality of your wood chips, of your processed wood chips, to have it enclosed at least with a roof and some walls in the back, that you have some basic equipment to process that wood chips, that it's not always about the contractors you can bring on site, that there are core critical equipment that you need for the durability and the consistency of your system, and that you always have wood fuel for your buildings. So there's chainsaws and it depends on how far you need to go into the value chain. There's usually a local sawmill or a struggling forester that is really eager to partner to fulfill at least the forestry side. A lot of communities still need to create at least the storage shed and platform to collect wood chips and to have kind of a yard to do seasoning. It's always recommended to get a wood chipper, even to sometimes, and have either have a wood chip truck and trailer so you can deliver wood chips at a bare minimum. And we outline some of those costs here and factor them into the overall cost of the project. Okay, so that kind of shows the full preliminary budget. we kind of look at the full scale and scope of what a biomass project requires as far as capital costing and planning. But now, how do we determine if we're at that right balance? How do we know that we have enough buildings connected, or we're oversized, or, you know, like, and sorry, that a lot of those answers are, you do energy audits on the buildings, you determine the heat loads, you size accordingly. But I guess what I'm trying to say is, do you have enough buildings connected to a central heat plant to justify the cost as well as the supply chain? And so a 10-year cash flow, the 10-year cash flow, you'll pro formas a lot of your assumptions of your costs and revenues so that you're able to determine what is a break even. You know, you can play around with your values. Where do I need to be in order to break even on a sales or on a you know, collective by year basis? Then you start running a net present value or internal return rates. And so what that basically means is that when you project your costs for 10 years and you project your revenues for 10 years, and you start, you know, incorporating some scaling, you know, that fuel is always going to go up, so you can give it an escalator, and that cost of living is always going up, and you know, so you can add those types of things. But then it's important that in year 10, if you're making $900,000, but what does that mean today? And so that's what the net present value calculation does, is that you discount future cash flows to present value terms. So that makes it obvious, at least at this level, that once you're able to get to this point, you can start to compare projects that, oh, if we heated this versus that, or if we got 25% funding versus none at all, how does that affect the business case? What does that mean for us as owners who have to carry the risk and responsibility of these units? Then we mess around with sensitivity analysis. And I already kind of discussed this a bit, where you're starting to look at what happens to price impacts to the feedstock or the alternative feedstock. So in this case, we look at what is the current cost for biomass wood chips per ton, and then we start messing around with on the access. Well, what happens when you add $10 in increments and drop $10 in increments? And then we compare heating fuel, the alternative, the true alternative, and we do it by 10 cents. And then you start to see in this sensitivity analysis a big green zone and a big red area. And the green zone shows you that you can actually make money in this business venture while the market is at least here. You have 40 cents variance before, you know, you're moving out into the uneconomic region, so that you can weather that price change in the marketplace, as well as in the biomass economy. Like if you have one supplier and they all of a sudden, you know, want to mess with you, will that jeopardize your project? Long story of short on that one is we're always looking for alternatives. And I think, you know, in that risk strategy piece, a big piece that we always look at is when we're building a biomass system in communities and we're creating the supply chain, there's no business in their right mind that would ever make an investment in something and have one local supplier. And so it's so important to diversify your supply alternatives. And with biomass, it's actually relatively easy in that when we're building systems, we're already maintaining what I'm calling the legacy system. So that's the heating fuel system. You know, if it's still got some use, it's still got some useful life in it. It's not creating any environmental issues. It can just sit there and that capacity can be utilized when needed. That's great. But I think the other piece of this is that for us, we're utilizing Hargasner out of Austria. You know, and I won't even like recommend that over anything else. There's so many great. Froling is amazing. There's so many great technologies out there, and they're all so similar in what they're able to do. But for us with the Hargasners, it's really great that when if we ever run out of local wood chips, we can order wood pellets. And those wood pellets is on a cost relative basis. It's just we're not getting all those local benefits, so it's not ideal. But in that crunch, we're able, and that's a risk strategy mitigation, we're able to order an alternative supply, thereby having supplier diversity. So it's just about looking at those types of problems, foreseeing that situation, and trying to really work with your partners to kind of start building out solutions on that. So what are my tips out of all this? And something that I've learned, I've done a lot of business plans for biomass specifically. We've done business planning for a decade, but in the last 3 or 4 years, I would say that we've been doing a lot of biomass and total renewable energy system solutions, but very specifically biomass. And what I found is that when you go to a community that's prospectively wanting to build something like this, and you're really trying to think through a lot of these problems, it's so useful to reach out to the technological suppliers, those who are delivering these systems or building out these types of solutions, either locally or regionally or nationally, and getting them, in that RFQ stage, just to start not being too prescriptive on the outset, being like, yeah, I know how to do this, even though I understand how this is done. There's so much that goes into a very intelligent outlay, and your suppliers are great resources to provide some of that thinking, critical advice. A lot of times when we reach out to suppliers, and I'll be, honest, I've done a similar project a dozen times, and this new supplier is just like, did you think of this? This is what my experience is here. And it just creates such great value for that client and that project. And I will say similar models, best practices, and other examples are gold. And so this is really where how we designed our system. It wasn't we didn't go to a designer and say, design it. We as a community of champions toured 100 systems, and every system we said, what did you do wrong? What would you have done better? And a lot of that really helped formulate and reinforce our thinking and in this scalable solution that we have now, and that I'm seeing more and more growing across the country. Reach out to funders early, get them involved in the process from the beginning. I've, in the Teslin case specifically, we've had a lot of funder success, and that has been because we've been very open and upfront and early with our funders so that they're excited with us. And then by the time we're ready to actually reach out to them, they're already advocating on our behalf. They've already got contributors ready to go. You put in one proposal, you get four. It's such a great strategy when you already know you want to do something and you're gearing up for it. Don't be shy. Don't be embarrassed that you don't know what exactly you're doing. They don't know what they're doing either, usually. But it's so important to have that joint learning curve with them, because they're going to be ultimately the ones who are going to have to represent you and that case to their superiors to get the funding that you require for success. And then cross-reference all assumptions with regional benchmarks. That's a big thing that, a lot of times, even myself, we're in the north, we go and consult in the south. It's still such a different world. It's more often the other way, where we have southern consultants coming consulting in the north, and there's not a lot of regional reference checks. Well, what is happening in similar projects in this region, in this environment, in this kind of neck of the woods? And you can really be alarmed at what does work down south, but does not work in the north at all. And those cross-references would open that up to you early. And really, and so I do appreciate all your attention. This is the big takeaway, and I am hoping for more questions. This is by far the most critical advice. The ownership, the operations, and the supply model is the most critical aspect of any and all biomass projects. And what I mean by that is that there is an alignment and integrated interest along the value chain. And I'll talk about that specifically. So for instance, if you have one entity that's operating, that owns and operates a system, and then you have another disparate, separate entity that's supplying that, but they don't have aligned interests, where this one just needs to get its output, it just needs to create this value, but this one needs high quality wood chips, this one just sees the value in just dumping it. And that misalignment creates a failed project. And we see that a lot. And what we're seeing more, and it's actually what's duly alarming, is that in Germany, in Denmark, in Norway, they've just been doing it right for a long, long time. It's not like they just discovered this. They've been doing it correct for a very long time. And so they make sure, so like a lot of times it's a farmer and they have a forest and they have all these buildings. And then this guy has a bunch of buildings. And then this guy has an accounting background. And then they cooperatively connect and they create a cooperative joint ownership model where all the value, all the skill set required for a successful business, one person's operating it, one person's supplying it, one person's selling and administering it. You created an aligned, integrated interest along the value chain and a successful project. And so that's something that you can get really easily in a First Nation community, in a simplified community environment where it's just the First Nations buildings or so forth, and you can be the owner, operator, and supplier. You are aligned intuitively. So there's opportunities there, but it's also, as scale grows, there's more people involved. It's just, and then open market is a critical component. It's just important to create the positive mechanisms to align and integrate interests along the value chain. Feedstock dependability and quality. I would say this is probably number one. I liked my first one because it represents the operational issues, but feedstock is specifically the root cause of all operational issues of biomass. Feedstock dependability and quality. And a lot of times it's because the technology that was picked for biomass requires a high grade wood fuel. The community picks it, but they think that they could have a wide inclusion of waste wood, and then they realize that they can't. And then they're screening, and then it just causes issues. What we're finding, and so we went with a really robust technology that had wide inclusivity, that we could throw all kinds of wood fiber into it, and it's quite robust in that way. But you really need to make sure that the technology you're choosing has that discrepancy on that it could take that wide variety of wood fuel and produce to that level, and make sure that you're consistently doing that, which is a bit more difficult in waste wood oriented feedstocks, but not impossible. It's not impossible. We're doing it in Teslin, and I mean, sometimes it's with its issues. Certainly, people dragging a piece of wood and then throwing it into a chipper is not going to be good for anything. So there's a lot of training that goes into handling wood cleaner. There's a bit more cost that go into that, but ultimately you're getting basically a free wood source that its only cost is that additional cost to transport it to your yard, because it had to be disposed of. So that's such a great fuel source, and it's the benchmark that we strive to achieve for in our region. And then finally, local opportunities and impacts. There's nothing more excited about all the opportunities that come out of a biomass project. And so I'll just talk about my community for a second, where when we started down this, and we were planning biomass and doing community economic development planning and doing the forestry planning, everything was kind of moving towards that. But as a real test, do people want this? We had some slashing contracts, and we, as a government, and we created a community corp that championed these types of opportunities. It was, a small slashing contract, required only 4 or 5 slashers. We put it out to the local market. 40 local slasher resumes came through, and huge interest. And we knew we were onto something, that people in our community really valued forestry, really missed being out in the land in that type of sector. And it was really put on us in that moment that this was something that we really needed to champion and do successfully. And it was all about the local opportunities and local impacts. And that's my presentation. And I am more than happy to just chit chat over anything you guys have to ask.
Yeah, we do have a couple of questions, Blair. So the first one is, how location dependent is biomass? Does a First Nation need access to timber byproducts?
Mm-hmm. So one of the misunderstandings.
Blair, you're muted all of a sudden.
I was muted, and you can hear me now, obviously. Okay, so I think that's one of those common misunderstandings in a lot of the communities that we go to, and in what is the scope and scale of the resource required to heat the buildings that we're moving towards biomass. So, for instance, in my community, we connected, I think, 10 buildings initially, and then we added more buildings later, and we have like pockets of district heating systems. But between all these buildings, we're looking at approximately 100,000 liters per year that's being offset. Well, that's a lot of heating fuel and a lot of dollars. But and then you think, well, that must be a truly huge amount of volume of wood you need to replace that energy with, and it's not. In fact, in that case specifically, we only need 400 cubic meters. 1,000 cubic meters, 1,000 cubic meters, which roughly equals about 400 tons, which roughly equals about 250 cords. If you think about that, that's almost like that's a personal use license. But we didn't go through that. We went through the commercial licensing avenue. We went through the higher burdens and through YESIB and getting permitting for the system. And even when we did all that, the engineers that we worked with, they were pegging our consumption at 2,000 tons. And, it really escalated our assessment requirements, and we achieved them all. But then when we're actually now looking at our consumption, and we always knew the consumption was going to be low, but engineers, when they come in, sometimes they are overcautious in their estimations. Our consumption is drastically lower than we ever expected, and we're seeing value in that. So the question was more so about location, and location's key because, and I mentioned this earlier, in that a lot of pre-strategic documents look at, just do a desktop study. They see heat loads, and then they create like a heat map, and that's kind of like an intuitive analysis that allows you at least to start ballparking where a good district heating system could likely go. And then once you have it there, I don't think you need to have one giant comprehensive heating system. For my community, that wasn't practical. There's too much geographic spread, but there were certainly pockets of heat consumption, and we now have 3 district heating systems heating those clusters, and 1 yard that with the wood chips supplies those three delivery points. And we were able to kind of break up the region and focus on the heat loads and just create logical distribution centers. So it's all about location, and it's all about relative heat loads and maximizing the cost of connecting to it. Consultants also factor in heat loss, and create, really fancy break-even charts to maximize distance and the amount of value you get from connecting to them. But, without going through all that burden, you can go into any community and you can see the obvious heat loads. Those 3 buildings connected, very close proximity, boom, there's a district heating system right there. And you can build it a little bigger in that it's not overscaled for its use, but it could be scaled for additional use, in that you could have an additional bay for another unit down the road or whatever. And that's common. We've done that ourselves. We build for this use, but we create the infrastructure footprint for a larger scaled footprint in the future, just so that it's possible.
Perfect. Thank you for that. A couple other questions here. One is from Corey. Thanks for the presentation. Question: with the example provided, do you recall the approximate IRR before and after grants that may subsidize costs/expenses? In other words, was it economically feasible before and after available so-called green infrastructure grants and or low interest loans?
Great question. The answer is that, and I mentioned this already, that biomass business cases are already really tough. And the problem with that is because there's so many other benefits that are social, that are environmental, that are local economic driven, that don't really pound for pound get equated into a business case. And then, and just the final piece to this is that the cost of externalities of the alternative of heating fuel is not factored into that case. And so when I have to go negotiate a heat agreement with a government that only knows the cost to heat that building, but has no clue the cost to build that unit, to maintain that unit, to replace parts and so forth, they have no clue on the cost of spilled oil or the frequency of its occurrence, and factoring that in. So when us in the biomass business case world, we talk about the cost of externalities and they're not being factored in. So let me just say all of that. And after saying all of that, those not being part of the formula, because it's just too difficult to quantify credibly. There's a lot of research out there that gives quantification to that. So there's reference points, but in a negotiation, it's hard to bring that in. We still compare with heating fuel. And so it's basically it's a very tight basis. And it's impressive that with the cost of building a new system, that the economics of the variable cost of the fuel is so good that it pays for itself on its own barely. And so when we do the IRR calculation before funding, we're getting in the realm of 7.5 to 8.5% IRR, which most people will know generates a near zero net present value. Because we discount to that rate, we consider future value of money to be roughly equivalent to 8%, 8% discounted year over year. Can somebody manage the microphone there? In that case, it's a marginal break-even business case. Then you start adding in the grants, and you're not only you're taking that cost of capital off, but the cost of finance, the interest, and so forth. It really does exponentially detriment a business case for anybody. But biomass is so sensitive and it's so positive to a community that it really earns funding. And I'll say it earns funding in that there is no other renewable energy project that generates as much local labor or local opportunities as biomass. And there's been research in that, is it a factor of 4 or a factor of 12 over even the next most locally impactful renewable energy project, which is wind, or solar is on the opposite side of the spectrum, because most of the economies of scales and manufacturing and value added is happening overseas where we're purchasing it from. It's very simple to set up and nothing to operate. Biomass is on the opposite end of the spectrum, where most of the work is involved locally. You got to build it, you got to supply it. It's a constant local economic opportunity creator.
Perfect. Thank you, Blair. And one last, more so of a comment. The project also creates local jobs using a similar cost. There is a cost saving from switching to fossil fuels to wood that creates employment.
You answered your own question there.
Mm-hmm. That was from Alvin. Any other questions? Please feel free to either speak up or just put them in the chat box.
Maybe while you guys are just typing your next question, I hope you enjoyed this presentation. If you are interested in learning more about myself, the projects that we've worked on, please feel free to visit our website, Gunta Business, Gunta business.com. And we have a lot of webinars and TV shows that have been put on our project. It's all viewable from there. You can watch the APTN TV show that they did. And, of course, they had the big budget to fly drones and everything while we're processing, while we're delivering. So you get a bird's eye view of this whole system operating. There's a lot of resources feel free to follow up with me. I would love to talk to you about your community project. So Gunta, thank you so much. I'll just give it a few more seconds, see if there's any last questions.
Thank you, Blair. No questions, just a couple of remarks. Thank you for your presentation. And somebody wanted to also know if we can rewatch this. And yes, recordings of all of the presentations will be posted in the conference app and will be available to delegates for 6 months to watch thereafter. So,
great.
And again, thank you so much.